Hello, could you help me grow this channel? Subscribing is totally free. Just one click below this video is all it takes.
They laughed at my dad like he was a damn cartoon. Blind war hero, they'd snort. That's just some bedtime story she tells herself so he doesn't look like a washed-up nut job. I didn't argue. I let them laugh, let them drink, let them feel big. Because if there's one thing my father taught me, besides how to reload a 9mm in the dark, it's this. The ones who bark the loudest usually scream the worst when it's quiet. So I stayed silent, smiled politely, and waited. And the night they tried to teach me a lesson, I opened the back gate, and they found out exactly who the hell taught me everything. I hadn't planned on coming back here, not to this town, not to these streets where every second mailbox still had the same dent in it from some bored teenager's baseball bat. But when I got the call from the home care service, when they said he was having trouble walking and couldn't keep up with his meals, I packed what little I still called mine, shoved the dog-eared photo of my dad in uniform into my bag, and drove 17 hours with nothing but gas station coffee and old Johnny Cash songs to keep me company. The town hadn't changed. That was the thing that hit me the hardest. I'd been overseas, I'd buried friends, I'd worked jobs where you count your heartbeat between footsteps to stay alive. But these people, these buildings, this broken old diner that still smelled like burnt bacon grease, they hadn't moved an inch. They'd all stayed right where I'd left them. Even the ghosts. The house was worse than I remembered. Paint peeling off like sunburned skin, the porch steps bowed in the middle, one window cracked in the top corner like a spider's web that never healed. But he was sitting there, in his same old chair, wearing the same wool sweater with the same elbow patches, tapping his cane rhythmically against the deck. "You're late," he said, grinning. I hadn't even made it up the first step before he spoke. Blind as ever, but he always knew. 2 hours and 12 minutes late, but I won't hold it against you. You brought that awful gas station coffee, didn't you? I laughed, because of course I had. That first week back was a strange kind of quiet. My dad, James, wasn't the kind of man who complained. Even when he probably should have. Even when walking from the bedroom to the bathroom looked like a slow-motion collapse. He never asked for help, not once, just kept tapping that cane like it was his heartbeat and telling me old stories. Stories I knew by heart. Stories that, truth be told, I stopped believing a long time ago. At least, I used to stop believing, back then. He'd tell me again about the jungle, about the one shot he never missed, about the man he saved with a makeshift tourniquet and a spoon. I'd smile and nod and stir soup that neither of us really wanted. And then I'd walk into town for groceries, pretending like I wasn't holding my breath. The first time it happened, I was standing in line at the pharmacy. Behind me, 2 guys, maybe 10 years younger than me, both wearing those local security jackets like they were uniforms for war, started talking loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You hear old man Sniper James is back at the edge of town? Nah, I thought he died 5 years ago. Nah, just blind and full of bullshit." I didn't say anything. I just let my fingers grip the plastic pill bottle until the ridges pressed into my skin. They kept going. I swear to God, if I hear that story about the 300-yard shot with one eye and no scope one more time. Dude's a walking meme. Like, what was it? Special Forces? Green Beret? Navy SEAL? Depending on the week? I heard he trained eagles to guide him or some crap. And they laughed. God, they laughed like they were in on some private joke. Like they were safe. That's what really struck me, their certainty. That cocky, smug, untouchable kind of laughter. The kind that only comes from people who've never lost anything that mattered. I paid for the meds and walked out without looking back. But that night, while I was helping Dad up the stairs, he touched my wrist. Just once. Gentle, but deliberate. "You heard them, didn't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. He didn't need me to. He just nodded. "Let 'em laugh. One day they'll learn there's more than one way to shoot." We didn't speak again that night. I sat on the porch after he went to bed, watching the streetlights flicker like they were too tired to keep trying. Something stirred in me, something old. I remembered the backyard drills he used to run with me when I was 11. How he'd make me crawl through the mud with my eyes closed and identify objects by touch. How he'd sneak up behind me in the dark and whisper, "Listen, not for what's there, for what's missing." I used to think it was a game, some weird blind man bonding exercise. I didn't realize he was teaching me something I'd need one day. I tried to let it go. Really, I did. But when I went to the diner 2 days later to pick up something for breakfast, the same guys were there. One of them, Dylan, decided to perform, loudly. "Hey, that's her, right? Claire, Sniper James's daughter?" he called across the room. I froze. "He teach you how to shoot bottle caps off fence posts while blindfolded too?" His buddy snorted so hard milk came out his nose, and that's when I said it. I didn't plan to, it just came out. Quiet, calm, real calm. "He taught me everything," I said. "Everything I know, I learned from him." Dylan made a show of covering his heart and pretending to wipe away a tear. "Aw, that's sweet," he said, "like a Hallmark movie with more camouflage." Then he winked. "You know we've got openings down at the warehouse, if you ever get tired of taking care of Rambo." That was it. That was the moment the timer started ticking. I smiled, said nothing, just nodded and left. Because I already knew I was going to take that job. I knew I was going to work the graveyard shift. I knew I was going to learn the layout of every hallway, every camera, every weak point in the place those boys thought they ran like a kingdom. But the difference was, I wasn't going to make the same mistake they did. I wasn't going to laugh. I was going to listen and wait. Because the thing about blind men is, they don't need eyes to see what's coming, and neither did I. The warehouse sat just off the edge of the industrial district, tucked behind a line of decaying pine trees and flanked by a chain-link fence that had more rust than metal left in it. It had once been a textiles plant, then a shipping hub, then a junkyard storage center, depending on who you asked and how much they'd had to drink when they told the story. Now it was managed, if you could even call it that, by Dylan Kessler and his idiot younger brother Rick, sons of Frank Kessler, who used to be the town's sheriff back when I was in high school and believed discipline could be taught with a belt and a six-pack. Dylan and Rick didn't inherit their father's spine, but they sure inherited his taste for control and spectacle, the kind that never worked unless someone else had to kneel for it. They called me in for an interview like it was some kind of performance. Dylan sat behind a cracked Formica desk, leaning back in a chair that creaked like it wanted to collapse under the weight of his arrogance. Rick stood near the filing cabinet, pretending to read a clipboard, though I doubt he could spell half the words on it. The whole thing lasted 5 minutes. I didn't lie, but I didn't tell the whole truth either. I said I had some logistics experience. I said I could work nights. I said I didn't mind a little noise or unpredictability. Dylan leaned forward, watching me like he was waiting for me to flinch. Then he smiled, thin and sharp, like a knife made of plastic. "Night shift, huh? Not many women sign up for that," he said, as if I'd somehow stepped outside the script he was comfortable reading from. I didn't smile back. I said, "I don't scare easy." That was all it took. He handed me a faded ID badge and told me to show up Thursday at midnight. I told him I'd be early. The job was simple on paper. Monitor inventory logs, make sure shipments were accounted for, and keep an eye on the motion sensors installed around the outer fence line. But from the first hour on the first night, it was clear they didn't expect me to actually do any of that. Half the cameras were broken or unplugged. The logs were a mess of chicken scratch initials and fake dates, and the fence sensors lit up constantly from what turned out to be nothing more than raccoons and wind. It was all noise, all distraction, and Dylan and Rick were never far. They'd show up during shifts, pretending to check in while dragging around six-packs and leftover high school football egos, talking too loud, laughing too much, and always making sure to mention my father in some roundabout insult dressed as small talk. The second week, I found a Post-it note taped to the back of my locker with the words, "Sniper's daughter, bet she shoots blanks." I didn't touch it. I just left it there, like bait on a hook. Then came the prank. It was crude and stupid, the kind of thing only someone truly small could dream up. I found my car with the battery cables cut and the driver's seat covered in raw eggs. The smell was impossible to ignore, and the message was loud, even without words. You don't belong here. Go back home. Go take care of your blind old man. I stood there in the parking lot as Rick drove past, honking and laughing out the window like he'd just pulled off some masterstroke of wit. And still, I said nothing, not a word. I just called a tow truck, paid the driver in cash, and sat on the loading dock until morning with a cup of black coffee and my father's old tape recorder playing one of his jungle stories back on loop. I think part of me wanted them to believe I was broken, that I was weak, because the longer they laughed, the more they revealed. I just had to keep listening. It was around that time I started watching, really watching. I memorized the routes of the trucks that came in and out. I took note of which cameras worked and which ones had wires that went nowhere. I noticed that every Tuesday and Friday, the back gate opened without any documentation in the log books, and two men I'd never seen before came in with unmarked crates and left an hour later with envelopes they never signed for. I also noticed that one camera near the northeast wall blinked twice every time a certain frequency was triggered by someone's burner radio. None of this was legal, all of it was sloppy, and none of it seemed to bother Dylan or Rick, because they believed they were untouchable, because they believed the only person watching them was a tired woman with too much baggage and no real friends in town. And maybe I was, but I was also something else. I was my father's daughter. And I remembered everything. One night, around 3 a.m, I opened my locker and found something new. A small folding knife, clean, sharp, and tucked neatly inside a cloth napkin that looked like it came from the diner downtown. There was no note this time, just the knife, but it was enough. It was a message, an escalation. They wanted me scared. They wanted me rattled. But they didn't know what a real threat looked like. I took the knife, folded it back into the napkin, and placed it gently into the breast pocket of my jacket. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't report it. Instead, I went home that morning, cooked breakfast for my dad, and asked him to tell me again the story about the time he got separated from his unit in Cambodia and survived 3 days with only a pocket knife and a shoelace. He told it like he always did. Steady, slow, with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing what death looks like and walking away from it anyway. When he finished, he leaned back and said, "Why the sudden interest?" I shrugged. "No reason," I said, even though we both knew there was always a reason. He just nodded, sipping his coffee like a man who didn't need the details to see the storm brewing. He didn't ask what was coming. He didn't have to, because deep down, he already knew. Just like I knew what had to happen next. Just like I knew the best way to silence a man who laughs at ghosts is to let him meet one. And mine was about to step through the back gate without a sound. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever stood in a room full of people laughing at someone you love, someone who sacrificed more than they'll ever understand, and felt your body go completely still, not with fear, but with purpose? Have you ever had to look calm while planning a war? Because that's where I was. That's exactly where I was. And they never saw it coming. It's a strange thing, the way memory clings to your muscles long after it's left your mind. Like the sound of a branch snapping under your foot when you weren't supposed to make a sound, or the difference between the click of a safety turning off and the nearly inaudible hiss of someone breathing too close in the dark. These things don't leave you, not really, and I think my father knew that long before I did. When I was a girl, I thought he was just eccentric. A man made half of stories and half of war, weaving his reality from faded photographs and redacted documents that were more rumor than record. But now, standing alone in the center of that dimly lit warehouse, hearing the steady hum of the refrigeration unit and counting the seconds between every flicker of the faulty fluorescent light above bay door number 4, I realized that what he'd given me wasn't a collection of war stories. It was training, covert, quiet, patient. My shifts had turned into reconnaissance. Every night, I clocked in without complaint, drank the terrible coffee that tasted like boiled rubber, and wandered the building with a clipboard in hand, not to log crates or inventory numbers, but to listen, to map, to absorb the rhythm of the place like it was a breathing thing. I knew which floorboards creaked under minimal weight and which ones stayed silent. I knew how many steps it took to get from the south dock to the fuse box near the break room without ever passing under a working camera. I knew that Dylan always parked in the same crooked spot near the emergency exit, and that Rick, who fancied himself a ladies' man despite lacking even the most basic hygiene, often snuck into the office to scroll through message boards on the dark web, thinking he was clever for using the public Wi-Fi to mask his IP address, not realizing that I had already installed a data siphon onto the router 2 weeks earlier. They had built their kingdom on assumptions and bravado, and while they strutted through it like drunk peacocks, I was memorizing every corner of their little empire. But even that wasn't the real work. The real work happened after I clocked out, after I returned home to my father, who sat each morning on the porch with that cane across his lap like a soldier's rifle. I'd make us both coffee, sit beside him, and start asking questions I hadn't asked in 20 years. He never looked surprised, never asked why I wanted to know the difference between a tripwire made from fishing line and one made from piano wire, or how to track movement through walls by listening for changes in ambient sound. He just answered, patient and calm, like a man explaining how to thread a needle or tie a proper knot in your shoelace. One morning, I asked him how he used to tell when someone was lying without being able to see their face. He tapped his cane twice and said, "The mouth lies, the breath doesn't." I practiced everything. Quietly, I used the basement to rehearse silent movement drills, walking barefoot across broken tile and scattered marbles to test my balance. I blacked out the windows and moved through the darkness by touch alone, using furniture as landmarks. I retrained my ears to recognize distances not just by echo, but by density, wood, metal, cloth. And in the warehouse, I ran simulations in my head during slow hours, imagining different scenarios. If Dylan came at me with a bat, how many seconds would I need to reach the mop closet where I'd hidden the modified stun device? If Rick decided to tail me after work, which alley offered the best cover and least camera exposure? Then came the night I tested my first move. It was subtle, simple. A misplaced manifest, logged under the wrong client name, tucked into the outgoing shipment folder. I watched from the shadows as Dylan cursed and tore through a pile of papers, too angry to consider the possibility that someone might be watching him scramble. I kept my face blank when he accused Rick of incompetence, watched the first cracks in their alliance open up like hairline fractures under pressure. I knew it wouldn't take much more. Just time, just the right nudge. But still, something kept gnawing at the edge of my calm. A sense that I wasn't the only one running quiet drills in the dark. One night, while checking the northwest wing, I found a set of muddy footprints trailing from the emergency exit to the maintenance closet, a closet I just checked 2 hours earlier. The shoes were too large to be mine, too clean to be Rick's, and Dylan never entered from the back. I stood in silence for nearly 5 minutes, listening. I heard nothing, but that meant little. Silence is a liar if you don't know how to question it. That was when I started sleeping with the recorder under my pillow, not because I was afraid of an attack, but because I knew I'd need evidence, not for the police, but for myself. I needed to know I wasn't slipping, that what I felt wasn't paranoia born from adrenaline and resentment. But the tapes confirmed it. Every night, around 3:30, the sound of footsteps. Light, deliberate, inconsistent pacing like someone counting. They were inpoggled. Someone was watching me, so I stepped it up. I left a trap in the back storage unit. A simple one made from 2 empty crates, a tension spring, and a bottle of industrial oil. Nothing that could kill, but enough to mark clothes, to leave a stain that couldn't be washed out. The next morning, Rick showed up late, reeking of something chemical and wearing a new jacket with the tag still on it. I didn't say anything, but I logged it, just like I logged the extra order of zip ties someone placed under my user ID, even though I hadn't made the request. Just like I logged the fact that the knife I'd stored in my locker had disappeared, only to reappear 3 days later, tucked under the toilet tank in the staff bathroom. They were testing me, probing for weaknesses, but they didn't realize I was doing the same, and I was better at it. By the end of the third week, the warehouse was mapped in my head like a battlefield. Every blind corner, every motionless camera, every possible point of escape or entrapment was cataloged. I stopped walking the floor like an employee and started gliding like a ghost. My clipboard became a prop. My steps became rehearsed. My glances tamed and calculated. I was no longer part of their joke. I was the quiet punchline waiting in the dark. And all the while, my father kept listening, nodding, sipping his coffee with a kind of patience that only comes from knowing that every insult, every cruel laugh, every sneer thrown at you in broad daylight eventually has to answer to the dark. And that's where we lived. Where we always lived. Because ghosts don't sleep. And neither did I. The storm that rolled in that night wasn't the kind that drizzled and passed through quietly, like most did in the early spring. It was the heavy kind. The kind that carried weight in its silence before it even hit. With air so thick it pressed against your skin like wet cloth and made every sound feel distant and hollow, like it had traveled through too much space to get to you. That storm wasn't a surprise. Not to the animals who disappeared hours before the first flash, not to the trees that leaned westward before the wind even came, and certainly not to me, because I had been waiting for it. Not just watching the weather reports, but watching everything, from the tides in the creek behind the warehouse to the way Dylan chewed his thumbnail when he was about to do something impulsive. I knew that storm would come. I needed it to. The plan had never been grand or cinematic. It wasn't something I scribbled on a map or whispered to my father like a scene from a spy thriller. It was simpler, slower, built from quiet choices and invisible shifts, each one too small to draw suspicion on its own. Like logging certain crates under false serial numbers, or convincing Rick during one of his drunken, late-night rants that the South Quarter motion detectors were faulty and needed to be bypassed temporarily. Or telling Dylan, in just the right tone of voice and at just the right moment, that I was worried about the gate motor making a strange noise, subtly shifting his attention to the one place I knew I wouldn't be. I didn't need a grand plan. I needed belief, and they had already given that to me in abundance. They believed I was weak. They believed I was alone. And they believed that whatever strength I might have had once had long since eroded under the weight of guilt and caregiving and too many quiet nights spent listening to an old man recount a past they thought was a lie. But what they failed to understand, what so many men like them always fail to understand, is that when you grow up learning to fight in the dark, you stop fearing what waits inside it. That night, I arrived 2 hours early under the excuse of covering for a coworker who didn't exist. And I spent those hours preparing, not in a frantic rush, but methodically, like setting a dinner table for guests who were too stupid to realize they were being fed to something they couldn't see. The electrical grid had already been mapped, with the main junction box carefully rewired to allow a remote-triggered short from the security office. All I had to do was flip the switch I had hidden behind the third panel under the desk. The north hallway had been rigged earlier that week, with a silent release snare made from pallet straps and steel cable disguised beneath a pile of disused packing material. The janitor's closet, which I had previously filled with cleaning supplies and left alone for weeks, now held an emergency floodlight aimed directly at face level, triggered by a motion sensor I borrowed from the now disabled camera system near the loading bay. Every piece was already in place. All I had to do was wait for them to come. And come they did, right on cue, with laughter echoing through the entranceway and the sharp clink of glass bottles already half empty. Dylan was loud, as always, overcompensating for nerves he didn't realize he had. And Rick followed, quieter but twitching, his eyes darting around the shadows like he could feel something crawling just beneath the surface of his skin. They were drunk, but not enough to stumble, just enough to be arrogant, which was exactly how I needed them. I stayed out of sight, in the corner of the monitor room, watching the few remaining live feeds flicker with static, and knowing that their blindness had nothing to do with alcohol or broken equipment, and everything to do with pride. At precisely 12:47 a.m., the main power line blew. The sound was like a distant gunshot, muffled by thunder, followed by the whine of systems going offline and the sudden silence of machinery, no longer pretending to be alive. Emergency lights flickered once, then died, as I'd ensured they would. The warehouse fell into darkness, real darkness, the kind that steals direction and makes sound your only compass. That was when I moved. I didn't walk, I glided, barefoot, counting steps and keeping close to walls I already knew better than I knew the lines on my own palms. I passed Dylan in the main corridor. He didn't see me, but I saw him, pausing at the junction box with a flashlight that barely worked, muttering curses into the air like a man trying to scare off wolves. Rick was already lost, somewhere in the back rooms, the sound of crates clattering and a distant shout letting me know he'd triggered the trap. One down, I circled around, retracing the path I'd practiced 27 times during my previous shifts, until I reached the security office again, where the final piece waited. I opened the back gate. Just like that. The mechanism clicked open with a metallic cough, and the cool night air rushed in like breath held too long. From the darkness beyond the fence line, nothing came, but it didn't have to. Because the sound of that gate unlocking wasn't just mechanical, it was psychological. It was a doorway. It was an invitation, and they heard it. Both of them. Rick screamed first. Just a noise, no words, followed by the frantic shuffle of feet on concrete as Dylan yelled his name and stumbled blindly toward the sound. That was when I stepped out from the shadows. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. I simply walked into the beam of the emergency floodlight I'd manually redirected, letting it hit me just as Dylan turned the corner. His eyes went wide, not because he saw a ghost or a gun, but because he finally looked at me, really looked, and realized he didn't know who I was. He'd never known. "You," he stammered, voice cracking under the weight of everything crashing down at once. I smiled, calm and steady, and said the only thing that mattered. He taught me everything. I left them there, with the lights out and the silence heavier than any storm. I didn't need to stay. I didn't need to finish anything, because it was already done. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about destruction, it's about revelation. It's about holding up a mirror so someone can see the coward they've always been and letting them drown in it. And as I walked away into the cold wind and the quiet streetlights flickering back to life block by block, I didn't look back once. I didn't need to. I knew they wouldn't sleep again. I knew every creak in their house would sound like footsteps, every gust of wind like breath on their neck, every night spent alone a reminder that somewhere out there, in the quiet dark, the daughter of the blind war hero was still listening. The morning after it all happened arrived in that strange, muted way only small-town mornings can, where the light is too pale and the silence too intentional, as though the entire world is holding its breath, unsure whether it should keep pretending nothing happened or finally acknowledge that something real, something unforgivable, has changed beneath the surface. I walked home with the early mist still clinging to my jacket like a veil, my hair soaked and heavy from the rain, but I didn't feel tired, not even after a full night of movement, calculation, and silence. In fact, I felt more awake than I had in years, more grounded in my body, as if the long-buried part of me that once understood survival on a cellular level had finally stood up and stretched. At home, my father sat on the porch as he always did, his hands folded neatly on the worn wood of the cane that had become as much a part of him as the faded sweater he refused to let me replace, his blind eyes facing the rising sun, like he could see something in it that the rest of us never could. He didn't speak when I approached, didn't ask where I had been, didn't raise an eyebrow or even twitch a finger. But when I sat beside him and handed him the coffee, I knew he would never drink while it was still hot. He simply nodded, and in that small, almost imperceptible movement, I knew he understood. I knew he didn't need to hear the details, the logistics, the misdirection, and the traps. The way Dylan had screamed when he slipped on the oil-slicked floor, or how Rick had sobbed behind the locked supply closet door, calling for a father who wouldn't come. My father didn't need the story. He had written it with me, years ago, in the dirt and shadows, and long hot afternoons spent learning how to be invisible. Later that day, word began to spread. Not from the boys themselves, because of course they wouldn't speak of what had happened, not directly, but from the ripples of fear they left behind, the panicked silences, the missed shifts, the sudden resignation letters submitted by men who had believed they were untouchable. The town didn't know exactly what went wrong, but it knew something had cracked. And in a place where secrets are currency and shame spreads faster than fire, the absence of bravado was more telling than a confession. Dylan didn't show his face again after that week. Rick, I heard, left in the middle of the night with nothing but a duffel bag and a black eye that he claimed came from a fall, though no one quite believed him. The warehouse changed hands quietly 2 months later, and nobody ever asked why the security logs for that stormy night were mysteriously wiped clean. Still, I waited for some kind of consequence, some reckoning, not because I feared it, but because I had trained myself to expect it, to prepare for the inevitable backlash that comes when you push too hard against men who aren't used to being challenged. But it never came. No police reports, no accusations, just whispers, the kind that linger in corners and surface at gas stations and church potlucks when they think you've left the room. They still call my father that old liar, but they don't say it with laughter anymore. They say it low, careful, like a prayer or a curse, as if even speaking his name too loud might invite something they can't explain. One afternoon, I went back to the diner. It was a test, maybe, or maybe just a need to see if anything had really changed. The same stool was open at the counter. The same waitress poured the same bitter coffee into the same scratched white mug. And across the room, one of the younger Kessler cousins, barely 20, leaned in and said loud enough for me to hear, "So that's the sniper's girl." But this time, there was no laughter behind it, only hesitation. I turned slowly, met his eyes, and let the moment stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable before I answered. "He's blind, not broken," I said, not smiling. "You? You've got 2 good eyes and still can't see what matters." The boy blinked, flushed red, and looked away. I finished my coffee in silence and left a tip that was far too generous for the quality of the food. Back home, my father sat in the same spot, the porch creaking gently beneath his chair, the air warm and filled with the scent of distant cut grass. He held a folder in his lap, manila and old, the corners softened by years of handling. Without a word, he offered it to me. I took it slowly, opened it, and found the truth laid out in grainy photographs, typed reports, names I didn't recognize, and places I'd only ever heard in half-spoken rumors. It was all there. The medals, the missions, the commendations buried so deep they were practically erased from history. For a long moment, I just stared at it, letting the weight of it settle into my chest. And then I closed it gently, placed it back on his lap, and shook my head. "I don't need it," I said. "I never did." He smiled at that, a small knowing curve of the mouth, and turned his face toward the sound of birdsong. Some truths don't need to be shouted. Some stories don't need to be proven. They live in the hands of the people who were changed by them, in the eyes of those who were told they were lies but knew better, and in the quiet revenge of a daughter who learned how to hunt in the dark without ever raising her voice. I didn't become who I am because my father was a hero. I became who I am because he never treated me like anything less than capable, because he showed me that you don't need sight to see people's intentions, because he taught me that silence is sometimes the loudest answer. And now when people speak about me in town, they don't call me Claire. They don't call me by my last name. They just call me his. And that's enough, because no one mocks my father anymore. And if they do, they never do it twice.